Howdy, folks. Yep, my name is Gabe. I'm one of the core devs at Sushi doing all things front end. So for those of you who are developers here, this is going to be more of a kind of technical talk. So if you like things like related to React, state management, React hooks, and the pain associated with it, this talk is for you. I have a theory. Depending on when you created your web app, the distance from when DeFi summer began determines how happy you are with the app. If you're me and you're working on one of the OG protocols, our web apps are quite painful. And here's the ultimate question I'm trying to get at here. How do we make our Web3 apps more sustainable? How do we make it so that when we're creating apps, they have longevity to them? The developers want to work on them for long periods of time, and this is what this talk is essentially going to be about. Kind of a quick aside, in the Ethereum world, we're really obsessed with client diversity, right? But us front-end devs, when we go to grab a framework for a Web3 app, what do we grab for, right? React, right? And not just React, we're probably using Next.js, and probably not just Next.js, we're probably deploying Diversal. Huge diversity here. Actually, I wanted to verify that in some extent, so I went through the top protocols on DeFi Llama down to the top 100, and yes, indeed, 84% of us are using React apps. Now, we could probably go through the implications of what that means is that there's not a lot of diversity with our web apps. However, for the most part, you can rest assured if you're a front-end dev in this space, you are experiencing pain in the same way that many of us are. Kind of as a side, I actually sent these apps to the Build With API, and there's not a ton of diversity as it relates to hosting, and even worse when it comes to DNS. All right, let's get back. You're starting a Web3 app for the very first time, and I have a theory, which is the destiny of your web app is highly determined by the conditions and the defaults that you set as you actually first bootstrap it. A lot of us are using, CLIs, right, to bootstrap our Next.js app. We're adding some TypeScript to it. If you're developing without TypeScript nowadays, you're probably doing something extremely reckless. However, read the fine prints, please, in your boilerplate code. TypeScript strict mode is very often off by default. TypeScript strict mode. If you're not familiar with this, this is a whole collection of rules that basically make TypeScript TypeScript. And the fact that this can't even be off astounds me. But this one specifically, strict null checks, is one that you really, really need to have. Here's an example. We have an interface, dog. It's got a method bark. We're instantiating it, and we're calling bark. Should this compile? Any thoughts? You know, without TypeScript strict mode, it will happily compile. With strict mode, of course, it should blow up, because this should be possibly undefined. Please set very strict defaults, the strictest of strict defaults as it comes to your Web3 apps. This is a riveting talk. I got one like on this. You could be the second. Please, when you're bootstrapping your Web3 app for the first time, use the strictest of defaults. This will come to bite you if you don't. It's very simple. Go to your tsconfig, add in true. When I first joined Sushi, I did this, and boom, the whole thing somewhat exploded. 1,500 type errors in our main app. These are 1,500 runtime errors, bugs. How do we fix this? Well, we can go one by one, right, through each one of these, spent an entire engineering month to fix this, or we could do kind of what we did, go through and spend an entire day commenting out the code with something obnoxious that says, please, please fix this to get our app to compile. At the very least, this ensures from that moment on, these type errors won't creep in. Please get some strict defaults. All right, for the rest of this talk, it's going to be Gabe's rants on why he hates hooks. We'll get this. However, let's go back in time to the MVC world. Does anyone even know what that means anywhere? Has anyone even worked on a Django or PHP app in here? Okay, someone knows what that is, right? So the back end was this like atomic unit, right? The unit of which all of the business logic in our app was contained, right? And it did things like call backends, call the database, and then you have the view layer. Right, this very thin layer that's only job was to collect data from the back end and display it. Now in the Web3 world, we have our back end, smart contracts. Why would we need anything more than this? and we have what we would call a small web app view layer, right? It should be only responsible for querying the blockchain, sending transactions, rights, requests. It shouldn't be big. Should it? Should it? My God, our web apps in this industry are colossal monsters. They're single-page, client-bloated nightmares, let's be honest. We're not in the best of states. Now, what are we trying to do when we're creating a Web3 app? Yeah, we're trying to query the blockchain. We're using some of these libraries. We're using some of these providers, these web wallets. We want to authenticate transactions by sending authenticated requests to the blockchain, and we have these helper libraries. In fact, some of you might be here working on some of these helper libraries. Thank you for that. But this is a new authentication primitive that only we in the Web3 world, in the front-end world, are currently dealing with. It's something new. And authentication in the back-end old world, MVC, was something more simple, right? We get a login page. It gives us a cookie back. We then send authenticated requests with this cookie, and our backend says, yep, this person can actually get the data. Somewhat simple. But now we've got, in the smart contract world, this little sidecar attached to our applications, a client-side authentication primitive of which we're deriving the wallet state. We're issuing queries. It's serving as our transport and authenticating the user. It kind of gives us a logged-in state. So we have these helper libraries that us front-end developers are using, and they're exposing something with it, right? They're exposing React hooks. Well, let's talk about React hooks. If the central primitive, of which all app state is being derived from a hook in your application, and you might know anything about React hooks, only hooks can call other hooks. So you have hooks calling hooks, calling hooks, calling hooks, and your entire application then becomes a state monster basically derived from the central primitive, authentication primitive of a hook. Why is that a problem? There's a lot of reasons why that is a problem, and why Gabe has a beef with hooks. One, it's making us into worse developers, honestly. It's introducing new and odd programming patterns that we've never really had to deal with, and it's a little bit unique to Web3 that our authentication primitive is making us do this. What you can't do, this is an example of what you can't do, right? You can't conditionally call it. You can't put a hook in an if clause. You can't loop over hooks. We find some very odd patterns for us trying to get away around this fact that we can't loop over hooks. You can't do this. You can't put it in the JSX. It can't be called when you want it on demand once. It has to be at the top level member of your component, and in theory must be running every time it re-renders, even though you need it once. Very odd patterns. It can only be used in React context as well. You can't use it in your state manager. Another reason why Gabe doesn't like React hooks. Here's an instance. Yep, this represents a value of a token that we're trying to get, and if again, it's hooks calling hooks, turtles all the way down until you get to the central authentication primitive. Now, what if we have many of these examples, many of these components? Are your hooks being intelligently shared, the instance? Anyone know? Is it reusing the instances in the memory? No. Every component gets their own copy of their React hooks, and they're isolated. And that causes you to go to the Performance tab, and I challenge anyone here to be able to understand what these hieroglyphics mean, but it's bad. Like, took very long. I have an M1 Mac. This thing could put a man on the moon with ease, but it can't run my web app. Use memo. You forget one use memo somewhere down this hook train, it is punishing. And it will punish you. Hard to test React hooks. I run just coverage on many of your apps, and your coverage is not very good either. If you have so much state bound into the hook world, it is very difficult to test, and this is embarrassingly low code coverage on one of our apps. Very often we're console logging, right? In our components, in our hooks. Why are things re-rendering? We're trying to be a detective, very difficult with hooks, and essentially it boils down, what I'd say, to this. We are not properly thinking through the separation of concerns. There's too much stuff in our components. Our components are too smart when they should be dumb. All right, so what should we do? about this? Well, if the chief issue is that our wallet state, our authentication primitive, is being injected and tied to the React render cycle, let's get it out. Let's inject it into our state manager. Let's put it in a state that is completely agnostic. It doesn't matter, it's vanilla JS. It could be used outside of the React context. This would be far more ideal. And now it's not so profound that I've come up here and basically said you should be using some state manager. But let me say that all of these patterns here represent vastly superior paradigms for managing your wallet state, composing with your wallet state, deriving data from your wallet state. You got the Redux global store, functional paradigm, you got the MobX, mutable classes, recoil, you got atoms and selectors, state machines. All of these are better to be handling your app state than being stuck in React hook world. What should your components look like? In my opinion, if you look at a component like this and 80% of it is basically the JSX with state being injected at the top, this is what your component should be like. Now, if you go and look at your component and way before you get to the JSX, you have a ton of different stuff doing business logic in your component, I would say that is a code smell and you're doing something wrong. Yep. Why is this a problem though? Why can't we do this right now? Well, as we said before, the way that we're interacting with our web wallets are reliant upon hooks, and they cannot be injected into a non-React state. So if you're working on one of these libraries, if the chief outcome of this talk can be anything, is one, please, 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 do not be making your web wallet libraries natively in React. Please make them framework agnostic, vanilla JS, and then at the very last second, then you can expose your React hooks. And even better, please expose your stores. Expose your stores in such a way that we can subscribe to them. And even better, we can inject them into our own state manager. So that allows us to compose from that layer, not the deep view layer. A couple of us at Sushi are running into this issue, so much so, and painfully so, that it's not sustainable in our architecture, that we're working on actually creating adapters that allow you to take Web3 React and use it outside of the React context and actually any type of state manager that you're using. Here's an example of ZooStand. All I want is to be able to compose within ZooStand. Please, if you're working on one of these libraries, expose a ZooStand slice that I can just put in, and then later and separately, I have access to that. I can compose within a non-React world. Now, if you want to be doing this, transitioning yourselves to the composing within state managers, here's an example of what you could do. You can write a component whose only job is to run the hooks of your wallet and sync them to your state manager. It's a little bit of a hack, but it does work. And then you tell the rest of the developers, never use these hooks again, compose at the state manager level, please, please, please. Now we're going back to the central premise. How do we write more sustainable web apps? This might not be super popular among front-end apps that, IPFS, it must be pure JavaScript, you can't have any backends. I would contest, right? There's certain things that backends allow you to do that front-ends really shouldn't be doing. Super heavy client-side work. Also, all the work that's being done in our huge bloated front-end clients are not being shared, whereas backends can do HTTP caching. And I would suggest to you that we can evolve our thinking a little bit on this, right? That I think we can use a backend, for example, Next.js serverless functions. I would qualify that as some degree of a backend for the sake of that it's easily deployed across many different services, right? I would kind of qualify that as, yes, you should be using that. We should open our hearts a little bit and count that within the decentralized camp. I would even say that if you go as far as making a Docker image that represents your entire application, there's so many different platforms that can deploy Docker images. Please, let's consider a separation of concerns and consider using some of the backends. I was checking out this tweet from one of the engineers on Lyra Finance last month, and he also said something kind of interesting. And we're talking about the idea of us in this industry are not managing wallet state properly. And there's ways that we can evolve our thinking on this set. He's basically saying, why do we need the wallet at all, right? If the wallet only exists to issue, write transactions. Every other use of it, which is reads, let's not rely upon that context. Let's use our own node provider. Really, really thoughtful. Saw this tweet from last week. This flash of when it says connect, and then it turns off, right? It's kind of annoying for a user. It's even more annoying, especially when I go to an app and it makes me log in with my web wallet before I can even use it. Please stop doing this, right? The reason why we're doing that is that our philosophy and our coding patterns on the front end as it relates to managing state is not developed enough. We can do better. As far as Sushi is concerned, we're also thinking about this, right? How do we manage state better? What if we make the state of the application more stateless? Let's inject the chain ID into a subdomain. Let's inject a address into the URL. That's an idea. Another idea is considering going old school. Why don't we cookie the user once we understand the state of the application, and then perhaps even using local storage. That could be, an option as well. Regardless, all of us, and I'd love to talk to some of you after this about how do we make our web apps more sustainable, and a key answer to this question, and my assumption, is we need to manage the wallet state better. Yeah, thank you.